December 7th, 1941, a Sunday morning in Hawaii. The rising sun cast its first light on the Pacific as sailors aboard the battleships of Pearl Harbor prepared for another routine day. Within moments, the stillness was shattered. Japanese aircraft, swooping low and fast, unleashed fire upon America's Pacific fleet. Explosions tore through steel hulls. The ocean itself seemed to ignite. By the time the smoke cleared, battleships lay broken in the harbor, and over 2,000 Americans were dead. The Japanese Empire had struck with ruthless precision, and in that moment, the Pacific seemed to belong to them. But Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. Across thousands of miles, Japan advanced like a tidal wave. Their forces swept into Malaya, striking deep into British territory with speed that stunned even seasoned commanders. Singapore, once believed impregnable, fell in just weeks. Japanese troops marched proudly through the city streets, their empire expanding faster than anyone thought possible. To the north, the Philippines, America's outpost in Asia, came under relentless assault. General Douglas MacArthur and his soldiers fought valiantly, but wave after wave of Japanese soldiers and aircraft pressed them back. The skies belonged to Japan. The seas belonged to Japan. On land, their army fought with discipline forged over decades of preparation. For American and Filipino soldiers, it seemed like fighting against a force that could not be stopped. In early 1942, the map told a chilling story. Japan's red banners stretched from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies, from the Philippines to the Solomons. Oil fields, rubber plantations, strategic harbors, all had fallen into their grasp. To their soldiers, it felt as though the Pacific was theirs by divine right. Commanders spoke of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, but in simpler terms, Japanese troops believed the ocean itself had bent to their will. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in particular, stood unrivaled. Its carriers had humbled the West's proudest fleets. Its battleships dwarfed anything the Allies could deploy in the early months of war. And its soldiers, hardened, disciplined, unwavering, pressed forward with a confidence bordering on destiny. Victory seemed inevitable. American forces, reeling from defeat after defeat, fought desperately to slow the advance. But to many in uniform, and to countless civilians watching the headlines, the future looked bleak. How could a nation that had been caught unprepared at Pearl Harbor hope to turn the tide against an enemy that moved with such speed, such ferocity, such apparent invincibility? The Japanese Empire had every reason to believe the Pacific was theirs. Their flag flew over islands where American soldiers had once stood. Their ships patrolled seas once claimed by the U.S. Navy. Their pilots controlled skies once thought too vast to dominate. For a moment in history, Japan's rising sun cast a shadow across the entire Pacific world. And yet, empires are never built on strength alone. Power can collapse not just from bombs or bullets, but from something invisible, something no soldier can see coming, because even as Japanese troops marched and their navy seemed unstoppable, across the Pacific, in laboratories, on ships, and in secret installations, American scientists and engineers were at work. They were harnessing a force that did not look like a weapon at all. It did not roar like artillery. It did not blaze like fire. It whispered quietly, hidden in static, and soon this invisible weapon would pierce the confidence of an empire. For in the Pacific War, Japan's greatest vulnerability was not in the seas they sailed or the skies they conquered. It was in the unseen spectrum of the airwaves, and inside those waves, a revolution was waiting. But hidden in the static of the airwaves was a weapon Japan could not see coming. Spring 1942. Across the Pacific Islands, Japanese banners fluttered in the wind. Soldiers of the empire stood tall, not merely as conquerors, but as men who believed destiny itself carried them forward. For them, this was not just war. It was proof of their nation's rising power, a dream of invincibility made real. At the heart of that confidence lay the spirit of Bushido. Every Japanese soldier was trained to see himself as part of an unbroken warrior tradition, stretching back centuries. Honor was everything. Death in battle was not a loss, but the highest service to emperor and nation. This mindset forged soldiers who fought with an intensity that stunned their enemies. To them, surrender was unthinkable. Defeat was unacceptable. Victory was not just expected, it was inevitable. The Imperial Japanese Navy carried this same belief onto the seas. Once a rising power, Japan had spent decades studying and modernizing its fleet. By the time war erupted, its navy was the most formidable force in the Pacific. Carriers like Akagi and Kaga launched strikes with unparalleled coordination. Battleships bristled with firepower that could outgun anything in the region. To American and British sailors, it often felt like facing a force from the future, and above it all soared the pride of Japanese aviation, the Mitsubishi A6M0. Sleek, fast and agile, the Zero outclassed nearly every Allied fighter in the skies during those early months. Pilots could twist and turn through combat with breathtaking control. For Americans flying slower, heavier planes, dogfights often ended in disaster. Survivors would later admit that the Zero seemed almost untouchable. Its reputation grew quickly, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of Japanese superiority. From the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Philippines, from the islands of the Solomons to the heart of New Guinea, the Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. Every victory confirmed their belief. The Pacific was theirs. Even commanders, seasoned veterans of decades of service, shared in this certainty. They had not just shocked the Western powers, they had humbled them. And in the glow of victory, confidence hardened into conviction. Yet confidence can be a dangerous ally. The Japanese High Command looked at their sweeping empire and saw a fortress stretching across the Pacific. But what they did not see was the strain of overstretched supply lines, the vulnerability of far-flung outposts, or the quiet momentum of American industry beginning to roar awake. To Japanese soldiers, the war looked won. To their leaders, the Pacific was locked in their grasp. But history was already shifting beneath their feet, because beyond the horizon, American forces were studying, learning, and adapting. They were finding cracks in Japan's shining armor. Every defeat carried a lesson. Every loss revealed an answer. Slowly, methodically, a new kind of warfare was being assembled, one Japan could neither predict nor defend against. The Bushido spirit gave Japanese soldiers courage. The Zero gave them wings, and their navy gave them dominance. But even the strongest warrior can be undone by an enemy he cannot see. Yet for all their confidence, they were blind to a revolution already in motion. Midnight, 1939. While the world teetered on the brink of global war, a quiet revolution was unfolding in laboratories across Britain and the United States. Scientists, armed not with rifles but with equations, wires, and oscilloscopes, were developing a technology that would redefine warfare. Radar. At its core, radar was deceptively simple, a system that could send out invisible waves into the sky, detect objects by the way those waves bounced back, and reveal the presence of planes, ships, or any movement beyond human sight. Yet its implications were revolutionary. It promised a way to see the unseen, to pierce the veil of night and fog, to transform the vast, unpredictable sky into something measurable, controllable, and most importantly, defeatable. By 1940, radar had already proven its worth. During the Battle of Britain, British commanders relied on radar to track incoming Luftwaffe bombers, scrambling fighters before the enemy even appeared over the horizon. Thousands of lives were saved. The seemingly magical ability to detect aircraft hundreds of miles away transformed defensive strategy. Radar did not tire, it did not blink, and it could operate in the dead of night or in stormy weather. It became a silent guardian, a set of invisible eyes that allowed a smaller force to confront a larger one with unprecedented precision. But the Pacific posed a different challenge altogether. Unlike the relatively confined skies over England, the Pacific was vast, a theater of thousands of islands, endless ocean, and immense distances that could swallow fleets and squadrons before they ever came into view. In this environment, the traditional methods of scouting, patrolling, and visual reconnaissance were almost useless. The Japanese Navy and Army, relying on speed, surprise, and their pilots' skill, assumed the immensity of the ocean worked in their favor. They believed that no enemy could see them coming until it was too late. Yet radar promised to change all of that. Engineers and military planners in the United States understood that if the technology could be adapted to the Pacific, it could turn the very oceans that Japan believed were theirs into a battlefield mapped in invisible signals. Ships could detect enemy planes before they struck. Islands could alert distant bases to incoming attacks. Even aircraft could carry radar to extend the range of detection. For the first time, the invisible would become visible, and the unpredictability of the ocean would become something that could be controlled, measured, and exploited. Pre-war research had laid the groundwork, but wartime urgency accelerated development. Laboratories were buzzing with physicists, engineers, and mathematicians who never set foot on a battlefield. They designed antennas, perfected pulse transmission, and calculated the precise way radio waves would bounce off metal hulls and wings. Every experiment, every test, every late night, calculation brought them closer to creating what some commanders would come to call the silent eyes of the American forces. By the time the first prototypes were installed on ships and remote islands, the implications were staggering. The Japanese, confident in their dominance of the Pacific skies and seas, could not yet imagine that the Americans were developing the means to see them long before they arrived. Every incoming plane, every advancing fleet, every carrier strike could be detected and tracked. The invisible curtain that Japan had relied upon for surprise was about to be torn away. The stage was set for a quiet, invisible revolution, one that would turn the vast Pacific into a battlefield, defined not just by ships and planes, but by signals, waves, and hidden eyes. A war fought at sea and in the air was about to take on a new dimension. And Japan, for all its pride and training, would be unprepared for what was coming. The Americans would soon deploy radar across islands, ships, and skies, turning the ocean into a battlefield of signals. December 7th, 1941. The morning air above Pearl Harbor was calm, the sun glinting off steel and water. But under that serene sky, instruments were quietly whispering a warning. American radar stations, still in their infancy, were detecting incoming aircraft. Operators, peering through dials and blinking lights, saw the unmistakable signatures of hundreds of planes approaching from the north. The threat was real, but the response faltered. Radar technology was still new, still unproven in the eyes of many commanders. Reports from operators at the Opana radar station went up the chain. Unidentified aircraft, heading fast, hundreds of miles away. Some officers dismissed it as a flight of B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. Others hesitated, unsure if action was warranted. In those critical minutes, judgment and skepticism overrode urgency. By the time the truth was realized, the first waves of Japanese dive bombers were already screaming across the harbor, dropping fire and steel. The destruction was immense. Battleships that had once represented American naval might were torn apart, capsized and burned. Over 2,400 Americans died, thousands more were wounded, and the Pacific Fleet was plunged into chaos. It was a staggering defeat, but it was also a wake-up call. Radar had worked. The machines had detected the threat before it arrived. The failure was human, not technological. In the weeks and months that followed, military analysts pored over every detail of the attack. Investigations revealed that the warnings had been clear. The operators had been accurate. The instruments had done their job. What failed was the system, the communication, the trust in new technology, and the decisiveness required to act. Pearl Harbor was not only a tragedy, It was a blueprint of what could happen if the potential of radar was ignored. American leaders learned a hard lesson. Never again would they allow radar signals to go unheeded. The Pacific was too vast, the Japanese threat too agile, and the stakes too high to make the same mistake twice. Across naval bases, islands, and ships, radar installations were upgraded, staffed, and integrated into command centers. Operators were trained not just to watch, but to interpret, report, and ensure that every blip on a screen translated into immediate, actionable intelligence. By mid-1942, the lessons of Pearl Harbor began to bear fruit. Radar was no longer a curiosity. It became a critical component of defense and offense. Early warning networks were established across Hawaii, Midway, and the Aleutians. Ships were equipped with the new technology, giving commanders the ability to track incoming aircraft long before visual contact. Air patrols were coordinated with radar data, creating a net that could trap even the fastest Japanese planes. For the first time, America was building a system capable of seeing and reacting faster than the enemy could strike. The psychological impact was equally profound. Where Japanese pilots had once assumed invulnerability in the Pacific night, American radar now turned darkness into a medium of defense. Surprise, the element Japan had relied upon, was no longer absolute. Every approach could be tracked, every formation mapped, every strike anticipated. The invisible advantage that Japan had counted on was beginning to slip away. The attack on Pearl Harbor, for all its devastation, had sparked a quiet revolution in military thinking. Technology and human ingenuity would combine to create a new form of warfare, one that transformed how battles were fought, how fleets moved, and how soldiers thought. The lessons of failure became the foundation of a future advantage, proving that even in tragedy, knowledge could turn the tide. And within months, the Pacific began to change. Night skies were no longer Japan's to rule. June 1942. The islands of the Central Pacific lay bathed in darkness, a vast stretch of ocean where Japanese pilots once moved like shadows, untouchable and unchallenged. Night had always been an ally to the Empire, a cloak under which bombers and reconnaissance planes could fly freely, striking without warning, vanishing before counterattack. For months, the Pacific seemed theirs to command, their dominance unassailable once the sun dipped below the horizon. But technology had begun to rewrite the rules. Radar, once experimental, was now being deployed across islands, airfields, and forward positions. Operators trained in its use could detect aircraft long before they were visible to the naked eye. Blips on a screen, faint at first, became the map of approaching enemy formations. Every movement of the Japanese planes could be tracked, predicted, and counted. Night, the element Japan had relied upon, was slipping from their control. American pilots, equipped with early warning data, began to mount night intercepts. They took off under the cover of darkness, guided not by the stars or moonlight, but by the silent signals transmitted across miles of Pacific water. Japanese crews, accustomed to flying without fear after dark, were suddenly confronted by American fighters seemingly appearing from nowhere. Bombers that once struck at will now met the crackle of machine guns and the roar of engines directed precisely by radar. The psychological effect was immediate. Japanese pilots, who had once considered night missions a safe haven, now flew with caution, aware that unseen observers could guide attackers directly to them. Confidence, which had been a cornerstone of Japanese strategy, began to waver. Training and skill could not overcome the invisible advantage of radar. In the darkness, the Americans were everywhere at once, or at least it seemed so to those in the cockpit. These operations were not just about shooting down planes. They were about reclaiming control. For the first time, the night sky, the supposed domain of Japanese superiority, was contested. American commanders could anticipate raids, position fighters, and even lure enemy formations into traps. Every successful interception reinforced a growing realization: Japan was no longer untouchable. Their empire, once thought secure under the cover of darkness, had vulnerabilities they had never imagined. The night became a strategic partner. Radar turned unseen threats into measurable targets, converting fear into opportunity. American forces discovered that technology could compensate for numbers, that foresight could rival brute strength. What had once been an uncontested advantage for the Japanese became a liability, exposing their tactics to counterattack and forcing them to rethink long-held assumptions. But while radar's impact on the skies was transformative, it was only part of a larger revolution. For every night fighter guided to intercept an approaching bomber, there were ships at sea, silently listening, scanning, and preparing. The Pacific, vast and open, was about to become a theater where no enemy could hide, not in the air, and not on the waves below. But radar's true power came not only from the skies, but from the sea. Summer, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a vast expanse where Japanese aircraft once roamed with impunity. From coral atolls to hidden coves, the Empire's planes struck with speed, precision, and a confidence born of domination. But now, the Americans were turning the ocean itself into a weapon. Ships equipped with radar formed what came to be called black pickets, lines of silent sentinels spread across the water, scanning, detecting, and warning of enemy approach long before the first planes could be seen. These picket ships were more than just early warning stations. They were the nerve centers of naval defense. Radar operators worked in dimly lit compartments, eyes fixed on glowing screens as blips moved across the cathode ray tubes. Each dot represented a potential threat: a squadron of Zero fighters, a formation of dive bombers, or even a shadowy carrier task force on the horizon. Communications officers relayed this information instantly to nearby ships, directing gunners, alerting fighter planes, and coordinating defensive maneuvers. In effect, the radar-equipped pickets extended the eyes of the fleet across hundreds of miles of open ocean, transforming vulnerability into control. Carrier groups, once prime targets for Japanese strikes, became almost untouchable. Radar gave commanders hours of notice, time enough to launch interceptors, adjust formations, and bring anti-aircraft guns to bear with unprecedented precision. Gunnery officers could track incoming aircraft electronically, guiding shells along invisible paths toward their targets. Every approach could be anticipated. Every strike could be met before it reached its mark. The Japanese pilots, trained to exploit surprise and speed, now found themselves constantly observed, constantly challenged. The black pickets also introduced a new kind of psychological warfare. Japanese air crews, accustomed to striking first and vanishing, now faced an invisible network of detection. Every mission required caution, every attack carried risk. Confidence, once the lifeblood of the Empire's operations, began to erode. And for American sailors, the black pickets became a source of quiet reassurance. The ocean, once an enemy in itself, had been transformed into an ally. Its vastness no longer guaranteed safety. Instead, it became a theater where American ingenuity and technology leveled the playing field. These picket lines were not perfect. Fog, rain, and technical limitations could interfere, but they represented a revolution in naval warfare. The sheer ability to see across hundreds of miles of open water, to detect an approaching threat hours in advance, shifted the balance of power. Tactics that had once relied on speed, stealth, and surprise were now countered by electronic eyes that never tired, never blinked, and never slept. As radar-guided defenses matured, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation. Japanese commanders, unaware of the full extent of this invisible network, continued to plan assaults as if the ocean were theirs to command. But American fleets, now guided by the silent watchfulness of radar, were ready. They could detect, intercept, and destroy before the enemy had a chance to react. The vast Pacific, once a domain of Japanese supremacy, had been transformed into a grid of observation and control, where every move could be anticipated. The implications were clear. Technology had given the Americans the ability to level the playing field, to turn the tide in an arena where numerical superiority and experience had once reigned. Soon, this quiet electronic warfare would collide with the chaos of battle in a way that no commander could ignore. And in one pivotal battle, radar would rewrite the odds completely. June 3, 1942, the waters of the Central Pacific shimmered under a fragile dawn. Mist clung to the horizon, hiding the movements of ships and aircraft. For the Japanese, the plan was flawless. A decisive strike meant to crush the remaining American carriers and cement control of the Pacific. Confidence ran high. Pilots, deck crews, and admirals alike believed the enemy was blind, scattered, and unprepared. They expected surprise, and they would be bitterly disappointed. American forces, however, had learned the hard lessons of Pearl Harbor and the months that followed. Radar pickets dotted the ocean, scanning silently, blips glowing on screens that translated distance, speed, and heading into actionable intelligence. From these black pickets, information flowed to carrier groups hidden beyond the horizon. Every Japanese formation detected, every approach mapped in real time. Scouts took to the skies, their flights guided by radar reports, filling in gaps where machines could not see. For the first time, the Americans could anticipate rather than react. By the morning of June 4th, U.S. commanders had pieced together a picture of Japanese movements that even the most experienced Japanese planners could not have imagined. Carrier positions, aircraft complements, and attack vectors were known in advance. American pilots, briefed and positioned strategically, could strike precisely at the heart of the enemy fleet. Where Japan expected chaos and advantage, they instead met an invisible network of preparation and foresight. As the first American planes lifted off from Midway's carriers, the difference radar made became undeniable. Pilots navigated not blind, but with exact coordinates, intercepting Japanese formations before they could execute their plans. Bombs fell on carriers that had expected invincibility, igniting decks and engines, creating confusion and fear. In a matter of hours, the tide of the Pacific War, so long flowing toward Japan, began to reverse. Where surprise had been Japan's greatest weapon, it had been neutralized. Every advance met a counter. Every bold maneuver confronted by knowledge gleaned from invisible signals in the sky. The Japanese fleet, confident in its mastery of distance and darkness, now found itself exposed. Admiral Nagumo and his staff struggled to respond to attacks that seemed to appear from nowhere. Carrier decks erupted in flames. Pilots were lost in numbers they had never imagined. The Pacific, once a domain of their strategic brilliance, had become a proving ground for American ingenuity and adaptation. Radar did not fight the battle itself, nor did it replace human courage, but it multiplied effectiveness in ways Japan could not anticipate. It turned islands, ships, and aircraft into nodes of a coordinated intelligence network. The advantage of technology, paired with disciplined execution, had created a force multiplier that fundamentally shifted the momentum of war. Midway was more than a battle. It was proof that preparation, foresight, and innovation could outweigh even the most formidable numerical or tactical superiority. By the end of the day, the consequences were clear. 4 Japanese carriers, the pride of the fleet, were lost. Thousands of experienced pilots and sailors, trained in the art of war and confident in their empire's destiny, were gone. The myth of invincibility crumbled, and the psychological blow to the Japanese military was as decisive as the physical one. The victory at Midway marked a turning point. Radar, scouts, and early warning had transformed strategy, giving America the ability to see first, strike first, and survive where previously it would have perished. The Pacific, vast and treacherous, was no longer unconquerable by the United States, and what began at Midway only expanded into a relentless American advance, one that Japan could no longer ignore or outrun. Autumn 1943. The Pacific was no longer a vast, unknowable expanse. From the coral-strewn atolls of the Solomons to the volcanic peaks of New Guinea, every island became a potential battleground. For Japanese forces, the days of hidden movement, silent approaches, and sudden ambushes were numbered. The Americans, now seasoned and relentless, wielded a new kind of weapon, one that did not roar or blaze, yet altered every engagement. Radar, amphibious landings, once perilous exercises in timing and courage, were transformed by electronic eyes. Radar-equipped ships patrolled offshore, scanning for enemy aircraft or naval reinforcements long before they reached the landing beaches. Commanders could time assaults with precision, coordinating bombardments and air support in a synchronized strike that minimized the chaos of traditional amphibious warfare. Troops moving onto hostile shores were no longer blindly advancing into traps. Every approach was mapped, every enemy position anticipated. Anti-aircraft defenses also evolved under radar guidance. Once Japanese pilots could weave through flak under the cover of night or cloud, striking with minimal risk. Now radar operators tracked incoming formations and relayed targeting data to gun crews with uncanny accuracy. The Japanese soon discovered that stealth in the sky no longer guaranteed survival. Air superiority, the cornerstone of their confidence, was constantly challenged, forcing pilots to rethink tactics honed over years of early victories. Long-range strikes became another advantage. Radar-equipped bombers and patrol aircraft could be vectored precisely toward Japanese supply lines, reinforcement convoys, or key installations. The vast distances of the Pacific, once a shield for movement and resupply, were now highways of exposure. Enemy positions could be located and attacked even before soldiers knew an American presence was near. Every movement, every fleet, every plane risked detection, and the element of surprise, the defining strength of Japan's early war strategy, was fading. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese soldiers, trained to expect stealth and dominance, now faced constant vulnerability. Every patrol, every landing, every night mission carried the invisible threat of being tracked, targeted, and countered. Confidence, that bedrock of military morale, began to erode as technology rendered age-old tactics ineffective. Where once the jungle, the coastline, and the open sea concealed movement, now invisible waves mapped every step, every approach, every strategy. American commanders understood this better than anyone. Radar was not just a defensive tool, it was a force multiplier, a way to extend influence across miles of ocean and dense island terrain. Coordination between naval, air, and ground forces reached unprecedented levels. Landings that might have resulted in high casualties were executed with surgical precision. Fleet movements that once relied on luck now relied on information and timing. The war had become as much about sensing and predicting as it was about firepower. By late 1943, the pattern was clear. The initiative had shifted. The Japanese, once masters of sudden attack and ambush, were increasingly reacting to a system they could not see. Radar allowed the Americans to dictate the terms of engagement, forcing the enemy into defensive postures and relentless retreats. Each victory, each secured island, reinforced the truth. The Pacific was no longer a domain where stealth and surprise guaranteed dominance. It was now a theater of information, where knowledge, foresight, and technological precision determined survival. The ocean, once a blank canvas for Japan's audacious strategies, was being transformed. Invisible currents of energy, transmitted and received in silence, mapped every movement and illuminated every approach. Where darkness and distance had once provided cover, there was now clarity. Where confidence had once bred dominance, uncertainty now took root. The ocean was no longer vast and dark. It was mapped, watched and lit by invisible waves. October 1944. The waters around Leyte Gulf roiled with tension as American fleets advanced toward the heart of the Philippines. Japan, facing relentless losses and a rapidly shrinking empire, resorted to a tactic born of desperation and ideology: kamikaze attacks. Pilots trained for one-way missions climbed into aircraft loaded with explosives, their sole purpose to strike and destroy, even at the cost of their own lives. It was a strategy designed to shock, terrify, and halt the American advance, yet the Americans had learned the lessons of the past. Radar-equipped ships patrolled in pickets, forming a layered defensive web that stretched across hundreds of miles. Early detection gave crews precious minutes to prepare, to position fighters, and to train anti-aircraft batteries on approaching threats. The blips on radar screens transformed potential disaster into a manageable, coordinated response. What had been suicide missions for stealth and surprise were now met with concentrated firepower. Guided by invisible eyes that never slept, kamikaze pilots approached with terrifying speed, plunging toward ships with lethal intent. But radar-directed gunnery had changed the calculus of survival. Anti-aircraft guns, vectored by precise electronic guidance, fired with accuracy that human eyesight alone could not achieve. Barrages of fire erupted in carefully timed patterns, intercepting planes long before they reached their targets. Fighters, vectored by radar information, met kamikaze aircraft in the air, cutting down attackers hundreds of miles from the fleet. Each loss of a plane or pilot was a blow to Japan's already strained resources. The psychological toll on both sides was profound. For Japanese pilots, the very act of diving toward an enemy now faced with an invisible shield introduced fear into a mission designed to glorify sacrifice. Confidence, which had fueled early victories across the Pacific, was replaced with dread and inevitability. For American sailors, the knowledge that radar could detect and counter these attacks instilled both relief and determination. The ocean, once a zone of lethal uncertainty, had become a controlled environment where survival was possible, even against the most extreme tactics. Radar did more than save ships. It reshaped strategy. Fleets moved with confidence, knowing that early detection allowed them to strike first, adjust formations, and allocate defensive resources efficiently. The Japanese, who had relied on suddenness, audacity, and the shock of kamikaze, found themselves outmatched not by numbers or firepower alone, but by a system that could see, communicate, and respond faster than human reflexes could manage. By late 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Japan's sacrifices were immense, yet increasingly futile. Each kamikaze attack intercepted before impact signaled a loss of strategic initiative. The Pacific, once thought to be theirs by right of skill and audacity, had become a domain dominated by unseen American eyes, guided by science, coordination, and relentless innovation. Every island seized, every fleet preserved, and every mission successfully countered strengthened the truth. The war could no longer be won by courage alone. The final irony was stark. Kamikaze tactics, designed to shock and intimidate, had instead underscored Japan's vulnerability. The very technological advantage the Americans had cultivated, radar, turned self-sacrifice into futility. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable now faced a reality it could neither prevent nor reverse. By 1945, radar had become so dominant that Japan's soldiers knew the Pacific was lost. August 1945, across the vast Pacific, from the islands of Okinawa to the coral reefs of Iwo Jima, the echoes of battle had faded. The war that had once seemed endless, fought in fire and steel, was drawing to a close. Yet the story of victory was not written solely in sinking ships or downed aircraft. It was written in something far less visible, a network of signals, a web of electronic eyes, a revolution in how men fought and survived. Radar had redefined warfare, proving that in the modern age, Technology could decide outcomes as surely as courage or strategy. For Japanese soldiers and commanders, the illusion of invincibility that had carried them across the Pacific for years was gone. They had believed in the supremacy of their skill, the discipline of their training, and the power of the night and sea to conceal them. Yet the very elements that had once protected them, the darkness, the open ocean, the distances between islands, were now allies of the Americans. Everywhere they turned, invisible waves mapped their positions, tracked their movements, and guided counterattacks. The Pacific dream, built on ambition and confidence, had been undone not by a single blow, but by a relentless, unseen net that left no corner of the ocean safe. The legacy of radar was profound. It transformed every aspect of the Pacific campaign. Amphibious landings were coordinated with unprecedented precision. Anti-aircraft defenses became lethally accurate, and carrier groups could operate with near impunity. Fleets could anticipate enemy movements before contact, and pilots could strike with the advantage of foresight. Battles were no longer chaotic clashes of luck and valor alone. They were contests of information, timing, and coordination. In every engagement, those who could see first, analyze faster, and act decisively held the advantage. American forces, once humbled at Pearl Harbor, had learned that survival required adaptation as much as bravery. Radar exemplified this principle. It allowed the United States to overcome initial disadvantages in experience and numbers, to transform lessons into strategy, and to create a multiplier effect that magnified the skill and courage of every sailor, soldier, and pilot. Technology did not replace human effort, but it amplified it, turning intelligence into power, anticipation into action, and preparation into decisive victories. The story of the Pacific is, in many ways, the story of invisible warfare. The battles that captured headlines, the carrier duels, the jungle skirmishes, the kamikaze strikes were all shaped by something most people could not see. Radar operated silently, persistently, and without fanfare, yet it dictated the rhythm of the campaign. It determined who lived and who died, who would advance and who would retreat. And when the final battles concluded, it was clear that the Americans' unseen advantage had been as decisive as any cannon or torpedo. For history, the lesson is enduring. Warfare had entered a new era, where the unseen could be more powerful than the visible. The courage of individual soldiers remained essential, but victory increasingly depended on systems, coordination, and the ability to harness technology to multiply human effort. The Pacific Campaign demonstrated that knowledge, anticipation, and innovation could change the balance of power, even against an enemy who had once seemed unbeatable. And so, the Pacific War ended not just with ships sunk or islands taken, but with a network of invisible signals that reshaped the battlefield and the nature of conflict itself. Japanese soldiers, no matter how brave or skilled, found themselves caught in a net they could neither see nor evade. The dream of dominion had been extinguished quietly, invisibly yet irrevocably. In the end, the war in the Pacific was not just one with ships and planes, but with signals in the night sky that changed history forever.